The empty chair and the first tone. The night sky above Karachi looked like it had cracked open. A river of falling light crossed the dark, silent city as if the heavens themselves were scattering pieces of some broken crown. In a small apartment, near the docks, Sana Qureshi stood at her window while the power grid died one block at a time. The lights blinked out across the city until the only brightness left came from the stars. For a long moment, the world felt ancient again, stripped of noise and neon and the pulse of modern life. Then she heard it, a low ringing inside her bones, like a note struck deep under the skin of the earth. At first she thought it was fear or imagination, but when she covered her ears, the sound did not stop. It pulsed behind her heartbeat, steady, measured, intelligent. She gasped and stumbled, gripping the window frame as a second wave ran through her. Her phone flashed once, then went black. The whole sky turned a strange color, like silver and green woven together. All across the city, people shouted, pointing at the meteors that seemed to fall slower than gravity should allow. Somewhere far out at sea, something roared and fell into the water. On the other side of the world, in New York, Nairobi, and Seoul, others felt the same vibration. A pilot on leave saw static patterns crawl up his coffee cup. A child in Brazil claimed she could feel the planets moving. The next morning, every AI news station talked about it, calling it the Aurora Pulse. Most people moved on. Sana could not. The sound never left her. It followed her into sleep, into the rhythm of traffic, into the hum of the refrigerator. She worked as a logistics coordinator for a shipping company, calm and practical, not the kind of person who believed in cosmic messages. But when the tone grew louder one night, she traced it to an old satellite uplink near the edge of the port. The station had been closed for years, its gates sealed by rust and vines. She broke the lock, walked inside, and found the air humming like the inside of a speaker. Dust hung thick, every grain trembling to the beat of that invisible rhythm. In the center stood a cracked metal sphere, half buried in the concrete, glowing faintly. When she touched it, images spilled into her mind, stars forming spirals, constellations, rearranging themselves into shapes of chairs arranged in a circle. All were occupied by shimmering figures except one which remained empty. Above it floated a symbol she somehow knew meant Earth. A whisper followed, soft and heavy with meaning. Final seed. Prepare. Then the light collapsed and a small holographic map appeared in the air, showing Earth marked with a pulsing red point. Sana stumbled back, breathing fast. She took out her phone again, recording the sphere, but the screen filled with static and strange patterns that almost looked like letters. Then she heard engines outside. Dozens of small drones flew low over the port, scanning with blue lights. She hid behind a rusted cargo crate as two black trucks rolled up. Men in gray armor stepped out, faces hidden. They moved with precision, carrying scanning rods and small cases marked with an unfamiliar triangle symbol. One of them knelt near the gate and said through his comm, "We have a relay signal. Confirmed non-human architecture." Sana knew she should run. But something in that tone inside her chest told her this was her moment to act. She recorded one last voice note and whispered, "If you find this, they knew about us before we knew ourselves." The men moved closer to the uplink. She took a deep breath and darted through the shadows, slipping inside the main hall again. The sphere was vibrating now, rising slightly from the floor. The tones inside her bones turned sharper, more focused, like a command waiting for a response. She reached out again, trembling, and the world changed. The roof peeled back like paper. A column of light shot into the sky, brighter than lightning. All across the world, others who had felt the pulse collapsed or cried out as the same light rose over their cities. Satellites caught the event, and within hours governments locked the footage away. The Aurora Pulse was renamed a meteor storm, an atmospheric glitch, a lie dressed as science. Sana stood under the open sky as the light faded. The drones turned toward her, scanners flaring red. Behind her, the sphere sank into the earth with a low rumble, leaving a circular mark scorched into the concrete. She knew she had awakened something ancient, something waiting for humanity to notice. As the first drone locked onto her heat signature, she whispered a single question to herself. Why had Earth's seat been left empty? And why did the entire galaxy seem so afraid of it being filled? Rooftop exodus. Human chain. The night after the pulse, the city did not sleep. Karachi was a sea of uneasy lights flickering from battery lamps and burning barrels because the power grid was still dead. The air smelled of ozone and seawater, and every few minutes the sound of drones passed low overhead. Searching, scanning Sana Qureshi stayed hidden inside a half-collapsed warehouse near the port, clutching the cracked metal shard she had pulled from the sphere. It pulsed faintly in her palm, and she could feel it beating with her own heart. She kept replaying the moment the light shot into the sky, wondering if she had just called something terrible toward Earth. She was not alone for long. A deep voice behind her said quietly, "You saw it too." She spun around and saw an older man in a worn flight jacket, gray in his beard and calm in his eyes. He introduced himself as David Hale, a retired astronaut grounded years ago for disobeying an order during an orbital mission. He told her that the pulse had hit him mid-flight on a private research plane, and that ever since then, he could sense magnetic north without instruments. He had tracked the signal to the same coordinates as her. Not long after, another stranger joined them, Eli Park, a quiet coder from Seoul, who had been studying strange data patterns in the satellite feeds. He carried a portable receiver that kept picking up fragments of the same pulse, and he believed the pattern formed language. He said he could hear words buried inside the static, something about activation and convergence. Sana realized that none of them were normal anymore. The pulse had changed, them all in different ways. When the sound of drones grew nearer, David led them up the stairwell of the warehouse to the roof. From there, they could see the port glowing with the red beams of scanning drones. Hundreds of people were running through the alleys below, some crying, others carrying what they could. The city looked like a battlefield already. Sana's shard vibrated harder whenever the drones came close. David noticed it and said quietly, "It's calling to them. We need to move now." They began to cross from rooftop to rooftop, guiding small groups of stranded civilians who had followed the strange light earlier. People trusted them without question, as if instinct told them that Sana and her two companions knew what they were doing. A teacher led her students single file along a narrow beam between two roofs. A group of dock workers passed wounded strangers hand to hand across a broken wall. A chain of ordinary people stretched over the slum roofs, carrying food and water by touch alone. Their courage built something invisible between them, a kind of shared rhythm, almost like the pulse inside Sana's chest. Below them, the drones fired warning flares at anyone moving in the open. The Vanguard convoy arrived at the port, in armored carriers marked with Earth Defense Initiative logos, but their soldiers wore no flags. Their commander spoke through loudspeakers, claiming they were here to secure the area for safety, but their scanners were locked on the spot where the sphere had sunk. Sana could see them dragging equipment from the trucks, machines that looked too advanced for Earth-made warfare. The civilians watched from the roofs, whispering to one another. Afraid, Eli decoded another burst from his receiver and whispered urgently, "It's from the same source. It says, activate the forge, awaken the fleet bound." Sana did not know what that meant, but David looked shaken. He said that in the archives of the old space program, there were rumors of an ancient network of stations under the Earth built by unknown hands long before humans learned to launch rockets. They called them forges, places meant to build something when the time came. The Vanguard team reached the center of the port where the concrete circle still glowed faintly. One of them shouted, "We've got energy readings off the scale." The air shimmered and the ground began to tremble. The shard in Sana's hand flared like molten metal. The pulse in her head became a clear voice saying, "One path forward, keepers of the seed. The forge must live." The meaning was clear to her in a way that frightened her beyond reason. The drones turned their lights upward, as if they sensed what was about to happen. David grabbed her arm and said, "Whatever you are about to do it fast." Sana stepped to the edge of the roof, raised the shard high, and shouted back into the sky, "I will not let them take it." The light exploded again, only this time it came from below. The ground at the port split open and swallowed the glowing circle. The relay sank into the earth, leaving behind only dust and heat. The shockwave threw drones from the air and scattered the soldiers of Vanguard in. The silence that followed Sana looked down at the crater that had replaced the uplink. She did not know what she had just done, but she could feel that the thing beneath the city was still alive, still listening. The shard in her hand had stopped glowing, but when she pressed it against her chest, she could still feel its faint heartbeat. Around her, people whispered prayers or stared in awe, as if realizing that something much bigger than war or science had just begun. The world above them had changed, and far below, in the tunnels of forgotten stone, the forge had awakened, waiting for those brave or foolish enough to find it. The forge and the law of the empty seat. When the trembling stopped, Sana Qureshi found herself standing on the edge of a crater. The air was thick with dust and the smell of burned stone. Below her, a spiral staircase of metal had appeared where there had been nothing but concrete moments before. It wound down into a faint blue glow that pulsed like the heartbeat of the earth. David Hale steadied her as the ground settled again. Around them, the city was silent. No drones, no engines. Only the sound of the wind brushing through twisted rebar. He looked at her with a kind of awe and said quietly, "You opened something that was never meant to stay closed." Sana could not answer because she already knew he was right. They climbed down into the pit, careful not to slip on the newly formed steps. The deeper they went, the cleaner the air became, until it smelled of ozone and rain. The walls were smooth metal covered in carvings that shifted like liquid text following their movements. Eli Park, who carried the receiver, kept muttering equations under his breath, trying to match the patterns to known languages. The characters reassembled themselves again and again until they formed words in English. "Welcome, Seedkind Forge, access granted." The floor opened beneath them, revealing a great circular chamber glowing with soft amber light. At the center stood a column of metal, taller than a building, humming with quiet power. It was surrounded by platforms and armatures shaped like half-finished machines. The forge, they realized, was not a factory but a living system, a kind of builder that responded to thought. The carvings along the wall projected streams of information, and for the first time they could read the truth about the law of the empty seat. Long before recorded time, the Orisi had created the Assembly, a galactic council of evolved species. Each world had its seat, but one was left empty, marked for a species that had not yet awakened. The charter decreed that when the final seed claimed its place, the Assembly would rebalance, and the oldest empires would lose their control. The other races came to fear that moment so much they agreed to seal the human seat until the seedkind proved worthy of it. Earth, they learned, had been hidden in plain sight, a planet veiled by forgotten protocols, disguised as an unimportant blue world, until the right signal returned. David paced around the forge, reading the luminous script aloud. He said, "This means the harvesters know that if we rise, their dominion ends. They must destroy us before we can claim that chair." Sana felt the weight of it sink into her chest. Humanity had never even known the game existed, and yet the rules had been written around them for millennia. The forge responded to their presence, small drones blooming from its core like metallic petals. They shaped themselves into tools, scanners and interface cables. Eli connected his receiver, and the forge displayed a schematic of a launch spike, a narrow tower designed to throw small payloads into the upper atmosphere. It required a power source not found on Earth. The only possible way to charge it was to connect to an old Orisi solar sail still orbiting as space debris above the equator. The plan was dangerous but simple. Use the forge to create a balloon lift and send a capsule high enough to intercept the sail. Once connected, they could channel that energy back to power the forge fully, and maybe contact the network of other hidden stations scattered beneath the planet. Sana agreed immediately. She felt that this was what the pulse had meant by prepare. They spent hours inside the chamber, learning to command the forge with intention rather than touch. It seemed to respond to emotion as much as logic. When Sana thought of strength, it printed solid beams. When she felt fear, it produced defensive fields. David tested the printed alloys and found them stronger than anything on Earth. The forge even produced food from condensed air to sustain them. The world above was falling into chaos as governments tried to hide the truth of the falling drones and strange Lights but below, in the hidden belly of the earth, something pure and old was breathing again. When they returned to the surface, the sky was bruised purple and heavy with smoke. Vanguard had regrouped on the outskirts of the port. Their black trucks, lined in formation, Leora, the medic from Vanguard, stood apart from the others, watching Sana quietly. She approached with her hands raised and said, "I was ordered to bring you in, but I saw what you did down there. I want to help." She told them that Vanguard had orders to seize the forge and hand it to private buyers who wanted to weaponize its material replicators. David hesitated, but Sana saw honesty in Leora's eyes and nodded. The medic joined their small group carrying a pack of medical tools and an old radio. The ground shook again, a deep vibration from beneath the docks. The harvester skiff had returned, its engines roaring like thunder. Vanguard soldiers shouted and fired at the sky, but their weapons did nothing against the armored hull. The forge beneath them hummed in warning, as if it sensed the danger. Sana realized there was only one way to keep it safe. She reached for the controls on the access platform and activated the old flood systems. The sea gates opened, sending a roaring wall of water into the tunnels. The forge's light dimmed as it sank beneath the rising tide, sealing itself again. The wave burst through the port, throwing men and machines into the surface. The water surged around her knees. Sana stood, firm, holding the shard against her chest. She had chosen to drown the tunnels and possibly lose the forge, to save it from those who would use it for power. The others stared at her in shock. David shouted, "What have you done?" She answered quietly, "I kept our future out of their hands, and if the forge is what it says it is, it will wait for us when we are ready." The city lights flickered back to life in the distance, and somewhere far above the stars blinked as if watching humanity's first real act of defiance. Edge of sky. Edge of trust. The flood had ended, but the forge had disappeared beneath the water, taking its light and its song with it. For 3 days, Sana Qureshi and her small group hid in the ruined districts of Karachi, surviving on emergency rations while the world above them twisted into confusion. Governments denied the existence of the pulse, the drones, the strange lights, yet millions had seen them. Satellites recorded a scar across the coast where the water had boiled, and the metal of the old port had turned glassy smooth. People whispered that something ancient had awoken beneath the earth, and that humanity was not alone anymore. Sana tried to rest, but the shard she carried kept beating faintly against her chest, reminding her that the forge still lived. David Hale worked quietly nearby, assembling strange equipment from scavenged drone parts. He had been planning something ever since they escaped Vanguard lines. His weathered hands moved with precision as he explained that the forge had given them blueprints before it sank, a design for a balloon craft that could rise to the edge of the atmosphere, carrying a small capsule that would connect with a derelict solar sail left from Arisi times. Said they could power the forge again if they reached that sail. Eli Park handled the programming of guidance systems, while Leora, the former Vanguard medic, treated wounded refugees who had joined them for protection. Together they built the skeleton of the craft from salvaged steel tubing and insulation foil. The city's night sky grew restless with storms as the air grew heavy with static electricity. Sana knew the pulse was climbing again, and that whatever force had awoken was not done. The shard glowed brighter with every passing hour, and one evening she heard a whisper in her mind, not in words, but in feeling, the same way wind shifts before a coming rain. It told her the time was short, and that eyes beyond the planet were turning toward Earth. She looked to the clouds and thought she saw something moving far above a shadow, like a ship the size of a mountain. When the balloon was ready, it looked like a patchwork miracle. Its outer shell was silver foil stitched from rescue blankets, its engines were medical oxygen canisters repurposed as thrusters. Its navigation unit was an old drone core rewritten by Eli with Arisi patterns. The capsule beneath was no larger than a truck cab, just enough for the 4 of them, and a small relay. They launched it from the tallest remaining building in the city as rain lashed across the windows and lightning tore open the clouds. The balloon lifted slowly, wobbling in the storm. David guided it using the sensors in his suit, and Sana felt the pulse rising with them, as if the sky itself wanted them higher. Hours passed as the city shrank beneath them, until all that remained was the curve of the earth, glowing faint blue under moonlight. They crossed into the thin edge, of space where silence swallowed every sound. The stars burned sharper here, and in that stillness, Sana could hear the hum of the old solar sail somewhere ahead, a melody of metal waiting in orbit. David smiled with tears in his eyes, saying, "It's been a long time since I've been up here. I never thought I'd see it again." The balloon shook as the thrusters adjusted course, and Eli announced that they had locked onto the target. But something else moved in the darkness above the atmosphere, a shadow gliding against starlight. A harvester interceptor had found them, its long silver hull reflecting the faint light of the sun. It closed distance fast, its engines pulsing in perfect rhythm. Sana felt the sound of its drive deep in her skull, and realized that she could sense its motion like a song. She told David to cut thrust at exactly the moment the pulse in her body dipped, and when he did, the interceptor's targeting beam missed them by meters. The craft tumbled but stabilized again, drifting weightless above the world. They reached the derelict solar sail, a massive sheet of gold foil folded and torn, but still alive with dormant power. Eli connected the receiver, and Leora secured the cables as David matched rotation with gentle bursts. The instant contact was made, a surge of energy ran through the capsule. The shard on Sana's chest blazed like a star. The forge below the ocean answered with a deep vibration, and the connection bridged Earth to orbit for the first time in centuries. For a few quiet minutes it felt like triumph. But then the receiver displayed an unexpected signal: Vanguard's encryption code. They had been tracked. Leora froze and confessed that she had sent a small pulse before the launch to divert Vanguard attention away from the civilians who were still trapped near the port. She said she thought it would buy time, but instead, it had led the enemy straight to them. David's face went cold as he realized the tracker might already be broadcasting their position to both Vanguard and the harvesters. Before they could argue, the derelict beacon near the solar sail began to glow. Its panels unfolded, and a voice echoed through, the capsule speaking Sana's name in perfect human tone. Prime Conductor recognized the beacon showed the circle of seats again, and this time Earth's chair was no longer dark. It shimmered faintly as if waiting for a decision. The others stared as Sana reached toward the image, realizing that she could feel millions of faint heartbeats below, all tied to hers. She did not yet understand what she was, but she knew that Earth's place among the stars had never been truly empty. It had been waiting for humanity to grow strong enough to claim it. Why the galaxy was afraid. The beacon hung silent in the darkness of orbit, its light stretching across the torn solar sail like a second dawn. The voice that had spoken Sana's name faded into the hum of space, but its meaning stayed heavy inside her chest. The others looked to her for answers, yet she had none. Her mind pulsed with new sensations, a flood of memory that did not belong to her alone. She saw images of alien worlds council, halls carved from crystal rings, and beings of light gathered around a vast circle of thrones. Each throne burned with the color of its people: blue for the Orisi, red for the Ovrang, gold for the Zyhar, and in the center one chair remained pale and cold like an empty promise that was Earth's seat, the one the others swore to keep unclaimed for eternity. The Harvester interceptor still drifted nearby, its damaged hull glinting faintly in starlight. Its crew watched in silence, perhaps confused or cautious. The humans' balloon craft clung to the edge of the old sail, tethered by cables that creaked with every motion Sana could feel. The pulse of the forge far below still connected through the shard that glowed on her chest. It was like a voice just beyond hearing whispering that the time to hide had passed. Humanity's rise could no longer be delayed. She turned to David and said, "The assembly left our seat empty because they were afraid of what we could become. They built rules to keep us asleep." He frowned and asked, afraid of us, why Sana closed her eyes, and the answer unfolded in her mind. Humans were born with what the Orisi had never possessed, the ability to bind emotion and reason into one instant of decision. When frightened, they learned. When beaten, they adapted. When united, they built more than weapons, they built meaning. The Orisi had studied humanity for ages, even before the first human spark of civilization. They called it the emotional singularity, species that could turn pain into innovation faster than any machine could calculate. The assembly feared that such a people, once awakened, would overturn the order that had stood for thousands of years. and so the law of the empty seat was written. No new species may ascend without invitation, and the final seed must never be allowed to bloom. David listened in stunned silence while Eli typed furiously, recording everything. Leora whispered that if Vanguard's higher command knew this, they would sell Earth itself to keep control of such power. The thought made Sana's stomach turn. Humanity's own kind would trade its future for security. The beacon pulsed again, projecting a map of orbit where multiple signatures glowed near the upper atmosphere. Harvester ships, dozens of them, were aligning above Earth. The flagship, larger than any city, hovered between the moon and the planet. Its massive engines lit the dark like a second sunrise. A countdown shimmered beneath it, marking 20 hours until extraction completion. Eli read the figures aloud and explained that the harvesters were preparing to drain Earth's oceans for fusion salts, the same way they had stripped dozens of seed worlds before. This was not conquest. It was harvest of a planet's life itself. Sana felt her knees weaken. David caught her and said, "We can still fight. We have the forge, and now we have power from the sail." Eli nodded quickly, saying that if they could transmit the sail energy back, down the tether line, they might awaken the other hidden forges beneath the continents. It would take coordination on a scale humanity had never attempted, but if anyone could rally that kind of unity, it would have to start with the people, not governments. Not corporations, just ordinary humans with courage. They spent the next few hours sending encoded broadcasts through every open frequency. Sana spoke directly through radio and shortwave, her voice carried across continents as she said, "We are not alone and we are not helpless. If you hear this, build whatever you can to protect your cities, connect to the signal, share your light. Every village, every ship, every mind counts. You are all Starborn now." Her words became a beacon of their own, spreading like wildfire across Earth. People began to move not with fear but with purpose. Mechanics rewired generators. Farmers used irrigation pumps to build air filters. Children tied reflective foil to kites and launched them into the air to confuse targeting. Systems communities that had never spoken to one another started building together makeshift networks that shared power maps and alerts. They called them the Mesh. Each city became a node connected by old radio towers and scavenged drones transmitting the pulse pattern as a global heartbeat. Even the poor neighborhoods of Karachi, where Sana had first seen the light, became a command post led by those who refused to surrender. The sense of unity was raw, imperfect, and human. Meanwhile, Leora intercepted Vanguard transmissions revealing that their Director General Anders had betrayed Earth entirely. He had transmitted the coordinates of the forge to the harvesters in exchange for safe evacuation for his private colony fleet. Leora stared at the data in disbelief. The director believed that the assembly would never let Earth rise and that the only way to survive was to kneel. Sana refused to accept that. She said if humanity's power terrifies the galaxy, then it is because they have never seen us fight for each other instead of against each other. We will show them who we really are. They worked through the night building plans for a mass driver on the ground, a long rail hidden inside the dry riverbeds that could launch small ships into low orbit once powered by the forge. David calculated trajectories while Eli wrote code for automated targeting guidance. The forge beneath the sea began to stir, responding to the returning energy from the solar sail, glowing in deep, rhythmic pulses that echoed through fault lines and rivers. The oceans whispered back and the tides grew restless. At dawn, the Harvester flagship began descending its engines, painting streaks of fire across the upper atmosphere. Governments finally broke, their silence broadcasting global evacuation orders as if abandoning their people was leadership. But the Mesh ignored those commands. Instead, messages of resistance filled the airwaves, a million voices saying the same thing. We are not leaving. This is our world. Sana stood at the viewport of the capsule, watching the sky grow brighter with enemy fire. Her heartbeat matched the forge's pulse. She felt the connection widening inside her as if invisible threads reached from her to every Starborn on Earth. The beacon's voice returned softer now but urgent. Prime Conductor, the field awaits you, the seat responds. She looked at her companions, David, Leora, and Eli, all exhausted but unbroken. They had become the start of something vast. The truth was simple. The galaxy had feared humanity not because of what they could destroy, but because of what they could unite. And in that moment, as Earth's skies filled with both light and war, Sana Qureshi knew that fear had ended, and the age of humanity had begun. The river that fires at the sky. The dry riverbed shimmered under the moonlight as if it were made of silver and fire. Sana Qureshi stood at the head of the assembled Starborn, linking her heartbeat with those around her. 12 people who had awakened just like her. 12 minds tuned to hers, forming a field of awareness that pulsed through the land. They could feel the subtle shifts of air and the vibrations of the earth beneath their feet. Every muscle in their bodies seemed lighter, faster, stronger. David Hale coordinated the needlecraft in low orbit, pointing them toward the Harvester flagship, hovering like a black sun above the planet. Its engines glowed orange against the dark, and its sensor vanes scanned for the faintest heat signatures. Civilians ran decoy convoys along the coastlights and reflective panels, mimicking the movement of the Starborn capsules. Leora moved among the volunteer teams from Vanguard, rallying their weapons and knowledge to the defense of Earth. She had turned on her own director, and now the field teams were working to overload power grids to provide extra energy to the forge. Hidden cradles and launch rails had been set up across the riverbed, connecting massive coils and battery packs, scavenged from abandoned industrial sites. The hum of electricity was deafening and yet harmonious, the same vibration that flowed through Sana and her companions as if the land itself had woken up to help. The needlecraft launched in synchronized pulses, slicing through the upper atmosphere. Their hulls were light and armored with materials printed by the forge. The pilots moved as one, guided by the Starborn link, seeing and predicting each movement of the flagship's drones. Before they could fire small pulses of magnetic interference from the ground, mass drivers scrambled the sensors of the enemy ships, rendering them blind. For precious seconds, each Starborn pilot could feel every electrical pulse in the enemy hulls, as if their minds were threading through circuits and wires. Children flew kites across fields loaded with foil and small batteries, creating chaff fields. To confuse targeting systems, civilians built makeshift decoys using mirrors and bright paint, reflecting radar and light signals. Every action was coordinated through the mesh, a network spanning continents. Even isolated villages knew exactly what to do. Guided by the broadcasts, Sana could feel the pulse of humanity resonating through each node. The field expanded, encompassing everyone connected to the Starborn link, amplifying reflexes, focus, and intuition. Eli injected false telemetry into the Harvester lattice, sending misleading signals of fleet positions and orbital calculations. The flagship reacted, moving to intercept imaginary threats. Its massive body shook and burned fuel, attempting to correct for errors that did not exist. Leora directed Vanguard field units to intercept Vanguard's own weapon systems, redirected now to shield civilians and support the mass driver. The director had underestimated the unity of the human networks and paid for it with the loss of control over his teams. Despite their efforts, the flagship began to siphon water from the oceans, its beams carving long lines of steam across the night. Sky Sana felt the panic in the minds of those below, but she also felt the collective will of the Starborn. The 12 of them focused together, their minds merging with the pulse of the forge beneath the seas, drawing energy from the solar sail and the awakened forges across continents. Sana extended the field outward, bending the siphon cone harmlessly skyward. The water returned to the seas, and the atmosphere trembled from the force of their combined effort. The flagship responded, firing a planet-killer lance, its core glowing white-hot, aimed directly at the Earth below Sana's. Pulse screamed through the field. She knew the risk of overloading the Starborn link could burn out the network completely. She hesitated for a heartbeat, but then reached deeper, connecting not only with her 12 companions, but with every Starborn, still conscious around the globe. Her mind became a river flowing into the pulse of the planet, guiding the energy of the forge into the targeting systems of the flagship. The lance dissipated as the energy rebounded from the forced alignment. The flagship shuddered violently. Pieces of its hull began to fracture under the strain. Its systems went offline one by one as internal cores began to revolt from the Starborn interference. Eli shouted as he watched telemetry collapse. The needlecraft danced around the flagship, slicing at its exposed sensor vanes and engine conduits with precision. David performed a slingshot skim across the thermosphere, pushing the limits of both craft and body. Each strike was a calculated move, choreographed, through the link as if all of humanity was watching through the eyes of the Starborn. Leora moved through the remaining vanguard teams, coordinating rescue of civilians caught in the urban zones. Her hands shook as she guided the last waves of people to safety. She felt the pulse of the planet through Sana and realized that this was more than defense. It was a proving ground. The humans had risen united against impossible odds, and they had become something more than ordinary species. The city, lights below flickered as survivors cheered quietly under smoke and fire, waiting for the moment when the flagship would falter. And then it did. The massive body of the Harvester flagship split along its core panels, cascading like a falling tower. Of black metal shards fell into the upper atmosphere and burned against the friction of the air while some debris floated toward Earth to be caught by the cradle devices built by the civilians. The pulse inside Sana slowed as the link began to settle. She collapsed to her knees, exhausted but alive. The Starborn field hummed softly across continents, and for the first time since the awakening, she felt a gentle calm wash over her. Humanity had endured the trial, and the galaxy had begun to notice that the empty seat was no longer void, claiming the chair, defining humanity. The dawn over Karachi was pale and trembling as if the city itself had just woken from a long nightmare. Sana Qureshi lay on the cracked rooftop of a half-collapsed building, her shard still glowing faintly against her chest. The air smelled of salt smoke and metal, and the wind carried faint echoes of distant cheers. From horizon to horizon, the survivors of the night before emerged, blinking into the new sun. Their eyes reflected the fires that had burned and the stars they had glimpsed above them, and most of all the understanding that Earth had survived something impossible. David Hale sat beside her, adjusting a small field communicator and checking the readings from the needlecraft that still hovered near orbit. Some had returned to base, some remained in a defensive pattern, watching for any remaining Harvester skiffs. Eli Park worked quietly with his portable terminal, weaving the global mesh together into a single coherent pulse using the remaining energy from the solar sail and the awakened forges across the planet. Leora moved through the streets, coordinating both survivors and vanguard remnants, turning what had been betrayal into loyalty and protection for the people. They all paused for a moment, sensing that the world itself was holding its breath. The beacon in low orbit glowed again, a soft silver now not threatening, but expectant. Its voice whispered in Sana's mind, telling her she could sing one final command through the Starborn field. But the words carried weight. They could change life and death across the planet. She understood in that moment that she could destroy the flagship's remnants completely, or she could choose a path that defined what humanity would be. Known for courage, yes, for survival, yes, but more than that, for empathy, for choice, for the ability to unite and not merely to conquer. She closed her eyes and felt every heartbeat connected to hers through the field. The mesh expanded through villages, towns, cities, and oceans, guiding every Starborn alive to hold. And wait, Sana raised her shard and focused her mind not on attack, but on rescue. She sent a pulse into the flagship's cores, reaching those minds that had been enslaved and coerced through the Harvester control network. She whispered commands of freedom, guidance, and direction. The cores shuddered, and then turned inward, rebelling against their own systems, slicing through the power conduits of the lance before it could fire. The energy cascaded harmlessly into space, and the remaining body of the flagship fractured the massive metal shell, spinning apart as the freed minds aligned with the pulse from Earth on. The ground people felt the air shift as if the world itself exhaled. Relief and disbelief washed through them. Children cheered, pointing at the skies as pieces of the Harvester hull fell safely into cradle nets constructed by the surviving engineers. The mesh guided every shard and every drive to a safe landing point. The forge below the seas responded to the comm of the Starborn field, printing repair units and support pods to catch and stabilize the debris. The planet was alive with coordinated rescue and innovation, a network of action that had never existed before. And yet it had awakened naturally in response to the Starborn link. David looked at Sana and said quietly, "You just chose what kind of species we are and how the galaxy will remember us." She smiled faintly and said, "I did what had to be done, not to prove anything, but because it was right." Eli nodded, saying that the mesh had captured telemetry of every event globally, every action, every pulse, showing that humanity had not only survived but had led with courage, intelligence, and compassion. Leora reached Sana and said quietly that the forge would now remain active permanently under the supervision of the Starborn network, ensuring that no power could be abused. Again, the beacon pulsed softly, and the circle of seats in the holographic assembly glimmered. Earth's chair, filled at last with a pale golden light. It was not marked by conquest or aggression, but by a song of unity and choice. Every being in orbit could feel it. The harvester remnants, the surviving needlecraft, and even distant observers could sense the rise of humanity as something new and unbroken. The rules of the galaxy had shifted silently and irrevocably. The empty seat was no longer empty. It was occupied by a species that had survived impossible odds, not through domination, but through connection. Sana stood finally on the rooftop, her shard warm in her hand. She looked out across the city, the survivors, the children, the elders, the volunteers, and the quiet heroes who had never thought of themselves as anything but ordinary. She understood, at last, that the galaxy had feared the wrong thing. The fear had not been of our weapons, but of our capacity to choose our own path, our ability to unite across every boundary, and to rise above fear and greed. David joined her and said softly, "Are we ready now?" She nodded and said yes, and together they watched as the sun fully rose, gilding the broken buildings and the repaired streets alike. The air carried a new sound, the quiet hum of the Starborn field resonating with every living being. On Earth, it was a sound of life, of hope, and of the beginning of a story that would be told for millennia. The empty seat had been filled, and with it humanity had claimed its place, not to dominate, but to lead with courage and wisdom. Sana Qureshi felt the pulse slow to a steady rhythm in her chest and smiled, knowing that for the first time in history, Earth was no longer a silent observer but a conductor of the future. The galaxy would watch and fear and wonder, but humanity would act guided by heart and reason together, and the legend of the final seed had truly begun. Epilogue: Humanity's First Dawn. The sky over Karachi glimmered in the pale gold of morning, as if the city itself had been reborn. The fires of the night before had cooled, leaving only smoke that drifted lazily over the streets. Sana Qureshi stood at the edge of a rooftop, looking out over the city that had survived impossible odds. The shard in her hand pulsed faintly, syncing with her heartbeat. It was quiet now. Not the frantic rhythm of battle, but the calm, steady pulse of life and connection. She felt every heartbeat of the Starborn still linked across the planet, a river of awareness flowing through continents, oceans, forests, and mountains. David Hale stood beside her, silent for a long moment, watching the horizon. The needlecraft hovered above the city, remnants of their daring orbital defense, drifting gracefully in the pale light. Eli Park worked nearby, relaying updates to the mesh, coordinating repair and distribution of the remaining forge-printed devices. Leora moved through the streets, ensuring survivors were guided to safety, and that the remaining vanguard teams were now protecting rather than threatening humanity. The city had become a living network of care and ingenuity built on trust, courage, and cooperation. Sana lifted the shard high and closed her eyes, feeling the pulse spread outward. She imagined the empty seat in the galactic assembly filling not with dominance or fear, but with understanding and choice. The beacon in orbit mirrored her intent, shimmering pale gold, as Earth's chair responded to the resonance of billions of hearts tuned together. The harvester cores that had been enslaved now pulsed freely and, aligned with the Starborn field, aiding in reconstruction rather than destruction. Humanity had not killed for victory, it had freed and healed, and in doing so had defined itself. Communities far from the city had begun to rebuild their networks of energy and transport guided by the mesh. Every village, every ship, every remote outpost had participated in the defense and now in the reconstruction. Each human who had touched the Starborn field knew that they were not alone. They had felt the power of connection and the weight of choice. the capacity to rise together in the face of threats beyond comprehension. Sana turned to David and whispered that the world had changed forever. He nodded, saying that the galaxy would take notice, but it would not matter what they thought. The measure of humanity was not in the fear of empires, but in the courage of ordinary people who chose to act with heart. She looked at Eli and Leora and saw reflected in their faces the same quiet pride tempered by exhaustion. They had done more than survive. They had set the tone for a future in which Earth's seat was no longer empty, and the galaxy would see that humanity would rise not to conquer, but to lead with empathy and wisdom. The shard pulsed. One final time, then dimmed, leaving a warmth in her chest like the memory of a heartbeat shared across billions of living beings. The city below was quiet now, the hum of life replacing the roar of engines and the crackle of weapon fire. Sana breathed, deeply feeling the presence of everyone who had survived and everyone who had joined in this awakening. Every Starborn was a note in a song that now played across the planet, a melody of hope, courage, and unity. The stars above were no longer distant, and cold but familiar companions watching the first true dawn of humanity. She closed her eyes and for the first time in weeks smiled freely. She could feel the world breathing around her, the pulse of life in every living being connected through invisible threads of choice and action. The beacon above glimmered softly, confirming that Earth's seat in the assembly was now claimed not by force, but by the courage to act together. She knew that the galaxy would never be the same, and neither would humanity. They had survived. They had risen, and they had chosen a future defined not by fear, but by the endless possibilities of unity and understanding. Sana opened her eyes, watching the sun rise fully over the city streets filled with survivors and volunteers and Starborn who had awakened to their potential. The world was alive with movement and the quiet hum of innovation and care. She knew that this was only the beginning, but the first step had been taken, and humanity would never again sit silently in the shadows. The empty seat had been filled, and the song of Earth had begun. The end.